At some point, you stopped trying. Maybe it was the job applications that never got answered, the relationship where nothing you did seemed to matter, the argument you kept having where no amount of reason changed anything, the situation where you did everything right and it still went wrong. And after enough of that, something happened, something that felt like acceptance or maturity or just being realistic. But it wasn't any of those things. It was your brain learning a lesson it was never supposed to learn. In 1965, psychologist Martin Seligman was working with dogs in a conditioning experiment at the University of Pennsylvania. The setup was simple. Dogs were placed in a harness and given brief, mild electric shocks. They couldn't avoid the shocks. No matter what they did, the shocks came. After a series of these inescapable experiences, the dogs were moved to a different chamber. This one had a low barrier in the middle. One side was electrified, the other wasn't. The design was intentional. The dogs could escape. They just had to jump over the barrier, one small action, and the discomfort stopped. They didn't jump. They lay down on the electrified floor and took the shocks. Some whimpered. None of them tried to escape. A control group of dogs, ones who hadn't experienced inescapable shocks, jumped immediately. The barrier was almost no challenge at all. They encountered discomfort, they looked for a way out, and they found one. But the first group had already learned something. They had learned that their actions had no effect on their circumstances. And that lesson, absorbed in the first chamber, traveled with them into the second one, where it was completely wrong. Seligman called this learned helplessness. What the dogs experienced wasn't stupidity or passivity, it was learning. Very efficient, very durable learning. The brain is, above all, a prediction machine. It observes patterns between your actions and their outcomes. When you reach for something and get it, it logs. Action effective. When you try to change something and nothing changes, it logs. Action ineffective. When that pattern repeats, when controllability is absent again and again, the brain doesn't keep trying. It updates its model of how the world works, and then it applies that model everywhere. This is what makes learned helplessness dangerous. It doesn't stay contained to the original situation. A person who has learned helplessness in one area of their life, a relationship, a workplace, a family environment, carries the updated model into new environments where the old conditions no longer apply. The person who spent years in a relationship where their needs were dismissed doesn't just have trouble communicating in that relationship. They stop communicating in the next one too. Not because the new partner is dismissive, but because the brain has already filed its prediction. Expressing needs doesn't work. The worker who spent years in a job where effort wasn't recognized doesn't just become disengaged in that company. They bring the same disengagement somewhere new, where their effort might have mattered because the model says it won't. Learned helplessness isn't a mood. It isn't laziness. It's a cognitive map that got drawn in one territory and then used to navigate a completely different one. Seligman and his colleague Stephen Meyer followed this research for decades. In 1976, they published findings that connected learned helplessness directly to depression, specifically to the uncontrollable bad events that precede depressive episodes. The symptoms overlapped almost perfectly. Passive behavior, difficulty initiating action, cognitive slowing, the belief that what you do doesn't affect what happens to you, the emotional flattening that comes from the prolonged absence of agency. What made this significant wasn't just the connection, it was the mechanism. If depression could be understood partly as the behavioral and cognitive result of learned helplessness, of a brain that had updated its model of control, then it wasn't just a chemical disorder to be corrected. It was a learned response that could potentially be unlearned. This led Seligman toward what he would later call the 3 Ps, the three variables that determine whether someone develops learned helplessness after adversity or recovers from it. The first P is permanence. People who experience a bad event and interpret it as permanent, this is always how things will be, this will never change, are more likely to develop learned helplessness. People who see the same event as temporary, this is difficult right now, are more resilient. The second P is pervasiveness. This always happens to me versus this happened in this particular situation. Learned helplessness spreads when someone generalizes a bad experience from one domain to all of them. A setback at work bleeds into how they feel about relationships. A failure in one area becomes evidence about their worth everywhere. The third P is personalization. Whether someone explains the event as caused by something about them specifically, I am the problem, or by external circumstances, this situation was the problem. Internal attribution for failure, when consistent and global, is one of the clearest predictors of who will develop helplessness and who won't. These aren't personality types, they're explanatory styles, habits of interpretation. And because they're habits, they can be examined, challenged, and changed. Before we go further, if this is connecting something you've experienced to a name and a mechanism, subscribe and like the video. New psychology content every week on Odd Humans. And every subscriber makes it possible to keep going. Back to it. The research has moved far beyond dogs in a harness. In 1975, Donald Hiroto replicated Seligman's findings with humans using loud, unpleasant noise. Participants who were first exposed to noise they couldn't control, even when later placed in a situation where they could stop it with a simple hand movement, often didn't bother. The ones who hadn't been through the uncontrollable phase figured it out within seconds. In 1980, Carol Dweck, whose later work on growth mindset would become foundational in education, showed that children who received feedback that implied their failures were fixed and personal showed learned helplessness patterns when faced with new challenges. They stopped trying harder. They assumed the challenge was proof of something unchangeable about them. In clinical contexts, researchers have found learned helplessness patterns in survivors of domestic abuse, where the unpredictability and uncontrollability of violence creates exactly the conditions that train the brain out of attempting escape. This isn't weakness. This is a brain that learned from experience, using the same mechanism that would serve it well in almost any other context. The question that follows all of this is the obvious one. If helplessness is learned, can it be unlearned? Seligman's later work and the entire field he helped build, positive psychology, suggest yes, but not easily, and not by simply deciding to feel differently. The brain updates its model of control through experience, not through intention. You can tell yourself your actions matter, but the part of your brain keeping track isn't listening to your internal monologue. It's watching what happens when you try things. This is why the intervention isn't motivational, it's behavioral. Small wins matter, not because they feel good, but because they demonstrate something to the brain. They are evidence. They are data points that contradict the old model. A person rebuilding from learned helplessness needs experiences, actual experiences, however small, where their actions produce results, where effort connects to outcome. This is also why supportive environments make a concrete difference, not because encouragement changes the model directly, but because encouragement creates the conditions for the actions that generate the evidence. And this is why the opposite, environments that systematically deny people control over their own outcomes, are not just unpleasant. They are neurologically damaging in a measurable, documented, durable way. The lesson Seligman's dogs learned was false. The first chamber was designed so nothing worked. The second chamber wasn't. But there was no way for the dogs to know that. Their only evidence was what had happened before. You are not a dog in a harness, but you are a brain that builds models from experience. And if your experience in a relationship, a job, a family, a culture has consistently taught you that your actions don't matter, the model your brain has built reflects that. It doesn't reflect reality, it reflects history. The difference matters. History is something you came from. Reality is something you're currently in. And reality, unlike history, is something you can test. If this gave language to something you've been living without a name for, share it. Like the video. Subscribe to Odd Humans for new psychology content every single week. We're small, we're growing, and every person who stays makes this channel possible. We'll see you in the next one.